you pointed out before we started talking, I wanted to talk about this latest weapons package, and I'll just pull up a story. So, as you mentioned, Brian, earlier, the United States has been kind of following Ukraine model with Taiwan, escalating with China at the same time. And here you have now Biden is actually fast tracking a $500 million package of arms aid to Taiwan. And it is the same emergency authority that's been used 35 plus times for Ukraine, said a source familiar with the plan. That's usually just means intel if it's anonymous. So that's what's happening. More arms to Taiwan, supposedly, because I know a lot of these arms actually get backlogged. But then, of course, there's been a flurry of other developments. There's the visit to South Korea, South Korea's president coming out on the Taiwan question pretty firmly on the side of the United States, and also the Washington Declaration now, nuclear submarines. There's been a lot of escalations of late. Where do you feel like this one sits now, and what do you think the significance of this is, given all that's going on for NATO and the collective West in Ukraine, let alone everywhere else?
This is the United States trying to consolidate its position ahead of this, again, this planned conflict that they want to provoke with China. And we've talked about many times regarding the window of opportunity the United States believes that it has between 2025 and 2027, where they can wage some sort of military conflict with China and have some sort of successful outcome, even though when you read what these war planners are saying about the outcome, it really doesn't look like a victory. I guess it's better than, in their minds, just allowing China to irreversibly surpass them. They think at least this way we have a shot at perhaps knocking China down a peg. Now, what's disturbing about the presidential drawdown authority, which is what they've been using for Ukraine, which is just taking weapons out of existing U.S. stockpiles and then sending them to Ukraine. They're doing this with Taiwan. They're doing this before a conflict has actually started. So they're getting ahead of the curve, so to speak. That they have said in their policy papers, we cannot afford any sort of delay. Once some sort of conflict is provoked, we have to get involved directly and immediately. So they're getting ahead of the curve by instituting this drawdown authority. You're right about the backlogs. I mean, this is a problem the U.S. has that is not going to go away. They have a limited military-industrial base that has a finite output that they cannot practically expand or increase by the time the window of opportunity closes. So they're just trying to do whatever they can with what they've got on hand right now. You're talking about South Korea. I'd like to throw in the Philippines as well. I saw the Secretary of Foreign Affairs in Washington at a CSIS event very recently. And okay, maybe he's saying all of these things because he's in Washington. And maybe if he was in Beijing, he would be saying a slightly more balanced story. But it was still very bad. And he was talking about, we need the United States to help uphold international law, and the United States is part of our future. And people forget that the Philippines was literally a colony of the United States. And they also seem, for some reason, to forget that the United States is on the other side of the ocean. It is not located in Asia. They also keep forgetting that China is the Philippines' largest trade partner. And so the Philippines is making, and just think about this too, China's offering trade and investment and infrastructure. When the Secretary of Foreign Affairs was talking about their relationship with the United States, it was entirely military. And it's a military relationship to antagonize the Philippines' largest economic partner, which makes absolutely no sense. So in essence, the U.S. is coercing them and using them as a military staging point for this war they want to wage against the Philippines' most important economic partner. It's insane. And it's more or less what they're doing with South Korea, and even to a certain extent Japan, because they both do a huge amount of trade with China as well. So the nuclear submarines, again, the nuclear submarines in South Korea, U.S. nuclear submarines in South Korea, people have made the point that this is only going to encourage North Korea to expand its nuclear program. It's not going to deter them in any way. I was talking with AJ from PTE Geopolitics, and he was talking about how, when they launch the missiles, they're not going to launch it from a South Korean port. They're going to launch it from way out at sea. That's the whole point of having intercontinental ballistic missiles. So they're only there to provoke North Korea, to create a pretext to keep or even expand the U.S. military presence there, which ultimately is there to contain China. That is the whole point. So this is how the U.S. has elected to continue its relationship with the Asian region. And essentially, it is an occupying military force, coercing governments to act against their own best interests.
Exactly. And as you said, yeah, the Philippines was colonized. It was it was a brutal occupation
Yes.
that was actually an open conflict. Lots of people died during that time, pre-World War II era occupation. And um, the current president is the son of kind of a notorious dictatorship, servile, more aligned with the West. But despite this, he has been also very much willing to engage and even expand ties with China. But earlier this year, we also had the Philippines expand military base cooperation. I believe 4 new bases were given access for the United States. And as you said, yeah, this feels like an intensified attempt to align these key players in Asia against China. I mean, do you feel like this is going to work, Brian? I'm very skeptical, despite South Korea, even Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan. I see a lot of people commenting about Taiwan's president and being so servile to the United States, and all of that is true. But do you feel like this is going to actually meet the objectives that the U.S. is setting out?
No, I don't, but I think it will replicate what we see going on in Europe, where you have most of an entire region destroying itself for U.S. Geopolitical ambitions. The problem with the Philippines is we had a president there who was resisting the U.S. and was building a relationship with China, but in a balanced way that was in the Philippines' best interests. And now you have a president there that is not really doing that so well. And the problem that the Philippines has, and this was a point that the Secretary of Foreign Affairs made, the Filipino Secretary of Foreign Affairs made in Washington at this event. He was celebrating the Fulbright program, the U.S. Fulbright program, and Peace Corps, and how long it's been going on in the Philippines. And the person who introduced him was talking about how this is how we create the next generation of leadership in the Philippines who are going to be part of this alliance. And in reality, it's not an alliance, it is subservience. So they are creating compliant, obedient politicians who make up a ruling class that are basically just US proxies. And that is what empire has always done. People focus on the military. There's an administrative aspect to it that is boring and people ignore, but is very powerful. And what it does is create a whole class of people in a society that will do what the US wants at the expense of their own people. This is the problem the Philippines has. Who's going to take over and fight for the interests of the people of the Philippines itself? And that it's not very clear who that might be. You talk to people from the Philippines, there are a lot of people who disagree with this and see how dangerous this all is, but unfortunately they're not in charge. And the US does this all across Asia. Yeah. And in Japan and South Korea, but also here in Southeast Asia, where I'm based. And you can see it growing and festering like a disease that is just taking over the body politic.
Oh, yeah. And I know you speak a lot about the history of colonialism as it relates to Asia and really much of the world. And this gross interference by the United States is all about cultivating, as you said, these compliant leaders. And Rodrigo Duterte, before Mr. I think his name is Bongbong Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos, the second son of the old, very pro-West regime in the Philippines. It's very different. Yeah, there is kind of almost a night and day, despite China's influence is so grand that the Philippines can't help but maintain that trading partnership. But politically, as you're stating, it is becoming more and more anti-China, not just in the Philippines, but also in Taiwan, which is part of China. But that there's a reason why the DPP speaks the way it does, acts the way it does. There was a reason why Tsai went. It's because this interference in the Philippines, in Taiwan, in Japan. I mean, Japan has this long history of essentially being a neo-colony of the United States. South Korea and occupied, we could just call it occupied Korea because its military is still almost de facto under control by the United States. So on and on and on, we're seeing Biden and the collective West trying to orient these countries against China. And I wanted to ask you about actually this report, because if we're talking about forms of warfare and this agenda against China, there's been a new report released by China's National Computer Virus Emergency Response Center and its internet security company 360, which talks about this phenomenon. I know you speak a lot about this, the various forms of war. And I'm wondering if you have any reaction to this. They have outlined a myriad of ways in which the Central Intelligence Agency and affiliated U.S. agencies have used cyber weaponry, cyber warfare in other countries. It talks about its own experience through Vault 7 leaks of WikiLeaks showing that the CIA had actually hacked into major Chinese industries for like a 9-year, they say ongoing, actually, a 9-year period beginning in 2011 ongoing. Also, there is the Northwestern Polytechnical Institute in China, which had private information of staff stolen. But we can go on and on and on of countries like Iran and Syria that have experienced cyber warfare from the United States, and China has put it all together in one report. What's your reaction to this, and where do you feel like it fits in this larger strategy that the U.S. has vis-a-vis China?
I actually have not read the report yet, but I wrote it down. I'm definitely going to check it out. But what I will say is that we're in the 21st century. It's the year 2023. And we have to think of information space as another domain, same as the air, sea, land. A nation protects its land borders, its airspace, its shores with a military, an armed military, and they're very serious about protecting the sovereignty. But in terms of information space, this other domain, people don't see it in the same way, except the United States does. In its multi-domain military theory, the information space is just another domain to invade, conquer, dominate in a targeted country. And so what you see is, and they're not going to do it with tanks, they're going to do it with their IT companies. So like Google and Facebook and Twitter, they had all been working with the U.S. State Department and the intelligence agencies doing precisely this. They create, basically they get inside of a country. They discourage that country from developing its own social media platforms. They also discourage them from banning or prohibiting, say, like Twitter or Facebook or YouTube. So what they want is to keep that medium there that they can control so that they can dominate that domain. And what does that do? I mean, if you can convince people of anything, if you control media or you mostly control it, you can convince people of anything, including adopting foreign and domestic policies that work against your own best interests. Think about Taiwan, these young people in Taiwan who want to be independent. There's no way Taiwan will exist as an independent country. Its economy will collapse. These people will be destitute, and they will essentially serve as just an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the U.S. And they will be subordinated by the U.S. indefinitely until something happens to the U.S., just like Japan or South Korea at this point. But they're able to do that by infiltrating and dominating the information space. So what it sounds like this paper is talking about is at least one aspect of how information space can be compromised and ways of defending it. And this is so vital, and every nation needs to start taking this much more seriously. Every country has some sort of ministry or department concerned with information space, but I don't think that they've rolled it into their military doctrine the same way the U.S. has, and it is the U.S. that is invading and attempting to dominate everybody's information space. So a very serious topic that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention. Hopefully this paper is an impetus toward rectifying that.
Yeah, and the paper notes just how invested the United States is in this just one particular phenomenon. And perhaps you can relate it to some others that you've covered in terms of perhaps the more soft power, indirect ways that the US tries to exert its influence and hegemony and dominance. The CIA, the report said, has 5,000 at least, but it says more than 5,000 hackers and 1,000 hacking systems. And it talked about all of these ways in which it infiltrates smart technology and computer technology, both against citizens, U.S. citizens, citizens around the world, as well as, companies and infrastructure. So could you speak about, like, what are these means? Like, how and how are they so important? Like, why are they so important? Because oftentimes, especially with Ukraine, we've been talking about what's happening on the ground militarily, shot for shot. But this does not get a lot of attention. This aspect.
Yes, and it needs much more attention. So in terms of the means, we've already talked about social media platforms, and we all have experienced how these platforms are manipulated by the U.S. State Department, intelligence agencies, even the military. Western militaries have manipulated it, and they've used it for color revolutions, and even in the middle of a war. NAFO is an example of this toxic cloud that they are able to create with disinformation and does just disruptive narratives that muddy everything and disrupt everything, distract, divide people. So there's that, and you have these armies of hackers. They have developed software where a single individual can have about 1,000 sock puppet accounts where they can control that, and they can create that type of presence on a platform like Twitter. So you see people saying, everyone has this experience. They're looking at Twitter and they see these horrible people saying these ridiculous things, and they have so many tweets and so many followers. How much of that is genuine and how much of that is the illusion of popularity and credibility? And so this is something that they are extremely focused on. And we see how nations like Russia and China and others, actually, Vietnam, I think, has or is developing its own social media platforms. They create their own social media platforms that they themselves control. And maybe the government there might abuse it, maybe not. But at least the people in that country have one less degree of separation between themselves and these platforms, and the ability to control or direct what might happen with them, how they're used. So that's one aspect. Another is hardware. We know that the CIA has worked with IT hardware companies to physically install components or modify components on computers to give them access, backdoor access, which is why countries need to start making their own computers, their own chips, and their own everything. It's just like, again, it goes back to the analogy of defending the traditional domains, air, land, and sea. You're not going to have the US come in and patrol your streets or your borders. You will do it yourself, and you will try to do it with as much equipment that you can produce yourself, because you know that equipment inside out. You know what was done with it, and you have control over it. You don't want to depend too much on another country. That's why Russia and China invest so much in military hardware. And so the same goes for information technology, computers, chips, smartphones, everything, because they are all vectors for this type of security compromise. And by controlling that, you're closing those loops, you're closing those vulnerabilities.